New York City in December. The streets glow with holiday lights strung between lampposts. Store windows showcase elaborate displays of winter wonderlands and gift-wrapped promises. Steam rises from subway grates, mixing with the exhaled breath of 8 million people moving through the cold. The air smells like roasted chestnuts and expensive perfume, and the metallic bite of snow about to fall. It's a city that never stops, never sleeps, never forgets to remind you that you're alive, surrounded, witnessed. But here's what most people don't understand about New York in winter. The cold changes things. Snow muffles sound, turns the loudest city on earth into something quieter, more secretive. Footprints disappear under fresh powder within minutes. Bodies can lie undiscovered in parks and alleys for months, hidden beneath brush that winter finally strips away. And crowds, those massive, protective crowds that make you feel anonymous, but never truly alone. They thin out when the temperature drops, leaving pockets of isolation on streets that feel safe the rest of the year. Winter in New York is beautiful, magical even. It's also the perfect accomplice. Tonight, we're going to walk through 7 cases where December's darkness and silence became enablers of disappearance. From the Gilded Age mystery of a socialite who vanished on Fifth Avenue in 1910, to the surveillance age horror of a man abducted during a blizzard in 2014. These stories span a century, but they share common threads. They all involve people who walked into the winter cold and never came back. Some left behind bodies that the season eventually revealed. Others left nothing but questions that still echo through the decades. This is Plain Sight Docs, and these are 7 Nyc Vanishings buried by snow and silence. The Heiress on Fifth Avenue. December 12, 1910. Manhattan, Fifth Avenue. If you could step into New York on that December afternoon, you'd find yourself in the beating heart of Gilded Age excess. Fifth Avenue wasn't just a street. It was a statement, a declaration of wealth so ostentatious it bordered on obscene. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Rockefellers. They all had mansions here. Massive limestone and marble palaces that stretched entire city blocks, their windows glowing with electric light that most Americans wouldn't have in their homes for another 20 years. The street itself was a spectacle. Horse-drawn carriages still outnumbered automobiles, though the new motor cars were becoming more common, their engines coughing blue smoke into the winter air. Women walked in layers of heavy woolen fur, their enormous hats secured with jeweled pins, their hands tucked into fur muffs to ward off the cold. Men wore dark overcoats and bowler hats, their breath fogging in the December chill. The sidewalks were crowded with holiday shoppers, servants running errands for their wealthy employers, businessmen rushing between appointments. Steam rose from subway grates. Gray slush accumulated at the curbs where snow had been trampled by thousands of feet. The air smelled like coal smoke and horse manure, and the expensive perfumes worn by women who had never worried about money a single day in their lives. Into this scene, at approximately 2:00 p.m., walked Dorothy Arnold. She was 25 years old, strikingly beautiful, with dark hair piled elegantly beneath a fashionable hat, pale skin that suggested a life lived mostly indoors, and the kind of refined features that came from generations of careful breeding and advantageous marriages. She wore expensive clothing, a long dark coat trimmed with fur, a dress that would have cost more than most New Yorkers earned in a month, gloves and a muff to keep her hands warm. Dorothy lived with her family at 108 East 79th Street, a mansion that reflected the Arnold family's position in New York society. Her father, Francis R. Arnold, was a wealthy perfume importer who had built a fortune large enough to support a lifestyle of absolute luxury. Her mother, Mary, was descended from Supreme Court Justice Rufus Peckham. This was old money, established money, the kind of family that appeared in the society pages and summered in Newport and never, ever dealt with scandal if they could possibly avoid it. Dorothy had plans that afternoon. She told her mother she was going shopping for an evening dress. She needed something suitable for her sister's debutante ball, an event that would be attended by everyone who mattered in New York society. She left the mansion alone, which wasn't unusual. Young women of her class had some freedom of movement during daylight hours, particularly in the safe, familiar territory of Manhattan's best neighborhoods. She took the subway, the relatively new system that had opened just 6 years earlier, downtown to 5th Avenue and 27th Street. This was the Ladies' Mile, the epicenter of fashionable shopping in 1910 New York. Department stores like Lord & Taylor and Arnold Constable lined the avenue, their windows displaying the latest Paris fashions and luxury goods. Dorothy's first stop was Park & Tilford, an upscale confectioner at 5th Avenue and 27th Street. She purchased a pound of chocolates, a box of candy that she presumably intended as a gift or perhaps just a personal indulgence. The clerk who served her would later remember her clearly. A well-dressed young woman, polite, unremarkable in every way except her obvious wealth. From there, she walked to Brentano's bookstore at 27th Street. She browsed for several minutes before purchasing a book, a humorous volume about a society woman. Again, the clerk remembered her. She paid in cash, tucked the book under her arm, and left the store. It was now approximately 3 p.m. Dorothy walked north on 5th Avenue, moving through the afternoon crowds of shoppers and office workers, beginning their early departures. The winter sun was already low in the sky, the shadows lengthening, the temperature dropping as evening approached. At 5th Avenue and 30th Street, she encountered someone she knew. Gladys King, a friend from Dorothy's social circle, was walking in the opposite direction when she spotted Dorothy. They stopped to chat on the crowded sidewalk, the kind of brief, pleasant conversation that happens 1,000 times a day in a city like New York. Gladys would later tell investigators that Dorothy seemed perfectly normal, happy even. They talked about the upcoming Christmas holidays. Dorothy mentioned she was going to walk through Central Park before heading home. She wanted to enjoy the afternoon air despite the cold. They said goodbye. Gladys continued south. Dorothy continued north, walking toward Central Park, which was just a few blocks away. That was the last time anyone who knew Dorothy Arnold ever saw her alive. She didn't come home that evening. At first, her family wasn't particularly concerned. Dorothy was an adult, and while it was unusual for her to miss dinner without notice, it wasn't impossible that she'd been delayed or had decided to dine with friends. The Arnolds were wealthy enough that they didn't worry about their daughter's physical safety in the same way a middle-class family might. But when she didn't come home that night, concern turned to alarm. By the next morning, when Dorothy still hadn't appeared and hadn't sent word, the family realized something was seriously wrong. Here's where the story takes a turn that would ultimately damage the investigation beyond repair. The Arnold family didn't call the police. They didn't report their daughter missing, didn't alert the newspapers, didn't ask for public help in locating her. Why? Because they were terrified of scandal. In 1910, a young woman's reputation was everything, and Dorothy Arnold had a secret that her family desperately wanted to keep hidden. She had been seeing someone, a man named George Griscom Jr., a married man she had met while traveling abroad. They had been carrying on some kind of relationship, the exact nature of which has never been fully established, that the Arnold family strongly disapproved of. There was also another complicating factor. Dorothy was an aspiring writer. She had written short stories and submitted them to magazines, all of which had been rejected. The frustration of those rejections, combined with the pressure of her family's social expectations and the complexity of her romantic life, had left her in a fragile emotional state in the weeks before her disappearance. The Arnold family feared that Dorothy had run away, that she had eloped with Griscom, or fled to avoid the pressure of her upcoming debutante responsibilities, or suffered some kind of nervous breakdown that had driven her to escape her privileged but suffocating life. Any of those scenarios would be socially catastrophic. The scandal would destroy not just Dorothy's reputation, but the entire family's standing in New York society. So, instead of going to the police, Frances Arnold hired private detectives from the Pinkerton Agency. For 6 weeks, these investigators conducted a secret search for Dorothy. They scoured hospitals and morgues across New York and the surrounding states. They investigated every lead the family could provide. They interviewed Dorothy's friends, discreetly, always discreetly, never revealing the true purpose of their questions. They tracked down George Griscom Jr., who was in Italy at the time of Dorothy's disappearance, and interviewed him extensively. Griscom denied any knowledge of Dorothy's whereabouts. He claimed they had ended their relationship months earlier, that he had no idea she was missing, that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The private detectives believed him. They found no evidence that Dorothy had run away, no train tickets purchased in her name, no hotel registrations, no sightings beyond that final conversation with Gladys King on Fifth Avenue. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. By late January 1911, more than 6 weeks after Dorothy's disappearance, the Arnold family finally, reluctantly, contacted the New York Police Department. The NYPD investigation was aggressive, but ultimately hampered by the massive head start Dorothy had on them. 6 weeks is an eternity in a missing persons case. Witnesses' memories fade. Evidence disappears. Trails go cold. The police did everything they could with what they had. They dredged sections of the Hudson and East Rivers, looking for a body that might have been weighted and dumped. They searched Central Park extensively, particularly the more isolated areas where someone could conceivably have been attacked and killed. They investigated the theory that Dorothy might have died during a botched illegal abortion, a common cause of death for young women of all classes in the early 20th century, and one that families desperately tried to conceal. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on dozens of reported sightings across the country. Dorothy had allegedly been seen in Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., even as far away as California. None of the sightings were credible. The case became a media sensation once the press finally got hold of it. Newspapers across the country covered the story of the missing heiress, printing her photograph and speculating endlessly about what might have happened to her. Theories multiplied like weeds. Some believed Dorothy had been murdered during a robbery gone wrong. Fifth Avenue in 1910, despite its wealth and prestige, wasn't immune to street crime. It was possible that someone had spotted her expensive clothing and jewelry, followed her into a less crowded area, and attacked her. Perhaps the encounter turned violent. Perhaps she was killed, and her body hidden or disposed of in a way that prevented its discovery. Others believed she had committed suicide. The pressure of her failed writing career, her disapproved relationship, her family's expectations, it all added up to a motive for ending her life. Perhaps she had walked into Central Park, found a secluded area, and taken her own life in a way that prevented her body from being easily found. Winter in New York can hide a body for months in the right location. Still others believed the illegal abortion theory. Dorothy could have been pregnant, by Griscom or someone else, and desperate to hide it from her family. She could have sought out a back alley procedure, one that went tragically wrong, killing her. The person who performed the procedure would have had every reason to dispose of the body secretly, to avoid prosecution for manslaughter or murder. And some believed she had successfully run away, that she had planned her disappearance carefully, perhaps with help from someone the family never knew about, that she had escaped to start a new life somewhere far from New York, far from the suffocating expectations of her class and family. That somewhere, under a different name, Dorothy Arnold was living the life she wanted, rather than the life that had been planned for her. The Arnold family, for their part, came to believe that Dorothy was dead. Francis Arnold spent the rest of his life, and a significant portion of his fortune, trying to find out what had happened to his daughter. He hired more investigators. He followed up on every lead, no matter how implausible. He offered substantial rewards for information. He found nothing. Francis Arnold died in 1922, never knowing what happened to Dorothy. Mary Arnold, Dorothy's mother, lived until 1928. She also died without answers. In 1921, the Arnold family had Dorothy legally declared dead, a necessary step to settle financial and legal matters. But declaring someone dead isn't the same as knowing they're dead. It's just an acknowledgement that hope has run out. Over the decades since, amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts have continued to examine the case, looking for something the police and the Pinkertons might have missed. Some have focused on George Griscom Jr., suspecting that his denials weren't truthful, that he knew more than he admitted. But Griscom was in Italy when Dorothy disappeared. His whereabouts are well documented. Unless he hired someone to harm Dorothy, which there's no evidence of, he couldn't have been directly involved. Others have examined the geography of Dorothy's last known movements, trying to identify locations where she could have been attacked or hidden. Central Park in 1910 was less developed and more isolated than it is today. There were areas, particularly in the northern sections, that were genuinely dangerous, especially for a woman alone. But extensive searches in the weeks and months after her disappearance found nothing. The illegal abortion theory remains one of the most plausible explanations, though it's impossible to prove without evidence. If Dorothy was pregnant and died during a procedure, the person responsible would have had powerful motivation to dispose of her body thoroughly. Thousands of women died from botched abortions in the early 20th century, and many of those deaths were hidden to protect the practitioners and the victims' families from scandal and prosecution. The truth is, we'll never know what happened to Dorothy Arnold. What we do know is this. On December 12, 1910, a young woman walked out of a bookstore on Fifth Avenue, carrying chocolates and a book, and vanished into the winter afternoon. She was surrounded by thousands of people. She was in one of the busiest, most populated areas of New York City. She was well-dressed, recognizable, exactly the kind of person whose presence gets noticed and remembered. And yet she disappeared so completely that more than a century later, no one has ever found a trace of her. No body, no evidence of foul play, no credible witness to whatever happened in the hours after Gladys King said goodbye. Just a void where a person used to be. The case remains officially unsolved. Dorothy Arnold is still, technically, a missing person, though everyone who knew her is long dead. Her story has become a kind of urban legend, a cautionary tale about the fragility of identity and the ease with which someone can slip between the cracks of even the most watched and documented places. And every December, when the winter cold settles over Fifth Avenue and the crowds thin out in the late afternoon, it's impossible not to think about that moment, about Dorothy Arnold walking north, alone, into the gathering darkness, about the last few steps she took before whatever happened next, about the silence that followed. The Girl in the Steamer Trunk. December 4th, 1933. Manhattan. By the early 1930s, New York had changed dramatically from the city Dorothy Arnold knew. The Gilded Age excess had collapsed into the Great Depression. The streets were harder, grimmer, filled with breadlines and desperation. But the city still attracted dreamers and schemers, people chasing opportunities that didn't exist anywhere else. Agnes Tuverson was one of the dreamers. She was 33 years old, a brilliant corporate lawyer who had clawed her way up from modest beginnings to establish a successful practice in Manhattan. In an era when very few women practiced law at all, Agnes had built a reputation as sharp, professional, and utterly competent. She handled corporate contracts, real estate transactions, complex business negotiations. She made good money, not wealthy by New York standards, but comfortable, independent, able to support herself without relying on a husband or family. She lived alone in an apartment in Midtown Manhattan. She had friends, colleagues, a structured life built around her work. And like many successful, unmarried women of her era, she faced quiet but persistent social pressure about her single status. Being unmarried at 33 in 1933 was approaching what society cruelly termed spinster territory. So when Agnes met Ivan Podorje, she thought she'd found something wonderful. Podorje presented himself as a captain in the Royal Yugoslav Army, a dashing European officer with impeccable manners, continental charm, and stories about his military service that made him seem exotic and romantic. He was handsome, in a dark, old-world way. He spoke several languages. He knew how to dance, how to dress, how to make a woman feel seen and valued. He courted Agnes with intensity and focus. Flowers. Dinners at expensive restaurants she probably paid for without realizing it. Declarations of love that felt passionate and genuine. He told her he had to return to Europe soon for military duties, but that he couldn't bear to leave without her. He wanted her to come with him, to marry him and start a new life in Yugoslavia at dawn. It was everything Agnes hadn't known she wanted. A grand romance. An escape from the grinding pressure of Depression-era New York. A partner who seemed to value her intelligence and independence rather than being threatened by it. They married on December 4th, 1933. The ceremony was small, simple. A few witnesses, a justice of the peace. Agnes wore a nice dress, but nothing elaborate. This wasn't a society wedding. It was a practical union before an international voyage. The kind of marriage that happened all the time in New York, where people came from everywhere and were always leaving for somewhere else. After the ceremony, they made final preparations for their honeymoon voyage to Europe. They would sail in a few days, beginning their new life together abroad. Except that's not what happened. In the days between their marriage and the sailing date, Ivan Potterjay made several purchases that Agnes apparently didn't know about. He bought a massive steamer trunk, the kind used for long ocean voyages, designed to hold several weeks' worth of clothing and personal items. But this trunk was unusually large, even by the standards of transatlantic travel. It was heavy, reinforced, built to withstand rough handling by ships' cargo crews. It was large enough to hold a human body. He also made inquiries about the ship's layout, specifically about his cabin and the cargo handling procedures. He asked detailed questions about when and how luggage would be loaded, where it would be stored during the voyage, whether passengers had access to the cargo areas. And he purchased the trunk several days before he told Agnes about it, having it delivered directly to the ship rather than to their apartment. On the day of sailing, Ivan Potterjay boarded the ship alone. Agnes Tuverson never appeared at the dock. Initially, no one thought much of it. Potterjay told the ship's crew that his wife had been delayed, that she would be catching a later ship, that it was a last-minute change of plans, but nothing to worry about. These things happened. Travel in the 1930s was unpredictable. The ship sailed for Europe with Ivan Potterjay aboard. And shortly after departure, while the ship was still in relatively shallow water off the coast, Potterjay requested assistance from the crew in moving something from his cabin. He said he had realized he'd brought too much luggage, that he wanted to get rid of a trunk he wouldn't need. With the crew's help, the massive steamer trunk was hauled out of his cabin and thrown overboard into the Atlantic. It sank immediately, too heavy to float. Gone. When the ship reached Europe, Potterjay disembarked and disappeared into the continent. No forwarding address, no contact information. He simply vanished into the chaos of pre-war Europe, where borders were porous and a man with the right connections could disappear completely. Back in New York, Agnes Tuverson's friends and colleagues began to worry. She had told several people about her marriage and the planned European honeymoon. She had made arrangements for her law practice to be managed during her absence. She had been excited, looking forward to the trip and her new life. And then, she simply didn't show up. Didn't sail. Didn't send word. Didn't contact anyone. Her friends went to her apartment. They found it largely undisturbed, with many of her personal belongings still in place. It didn't look like someone who had packed for a long trip abroad. It looked like someone who had stepped out expecting to return shortly. They contacted the police. The NYPD investigation moved quickly once they understood the timeline. They identified Ivan Potterjay as the last person known to have seen Agnes. They discovered the marriage certificate. And crucially, they began tracing Potterjay's movements in the days before sailing. The steamer trunk purchase was the smoking gun. Investigators tracked down the store where Potterjay had bought it. The clerk remembered him clearly. He had been very specific about the size, insisting on the largest trunk available. He had paid in cash and arranged for immediate delivery to the ship. The shipping company confirmed that an unusually large trunk had been delivered to Potterjay's cabin before the sailing date. And crew members confirmed that Potterjay had disposed of a heavy trunk at sea several days into the voyage. The timeline was devastating in its clarity. December 4th, Ivan and Agnes marry. December 5th, 6th, Potterjay purchases the large steamer trunk and has it delivered to the ship. December 7th, the day the ship sails. Agnes is never seen again. December 8th or 9th, Potterjay disposes of the trunk at sea. Then NYPD's theory was straightforward and horrifying. Ivan Potterjay had married Agnes Tuverson with the intention of killing her. Possibly for money, though Agnes wasn't wealthy enough for that to be a compelling motive. More likely, it was a combination of factors. Perhaps he had needed a wife for immigration or identity purposes, and then decided she was a liability. Perhaps the marriage was part of a larger con that went wrong. Perhaps he was simply a predator who had identified a vulnerable target, a successful, unmarried woman who might be lonely enough to overlook warning signs. Whatever his motive, the evidence suggested he had killed Agnes sometime between their marriage on December 4th and the ship's departure on December 7th. He had stuffed her body into the steamer trunk he'd purchased specifically for that purpose. He had arranged for the trunk to be delivered to his cabin. And then, once the ship was at sea and disposal was safe, he had thrown it overboard, sending Agnes's body to the bottom of the Atlantic, where it would never be recovered. It was cold, calculated, planned. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was premeditated murder with a clear disposal plan. Then IPD issued a warrant for Ivan Podorjay's arrest on suspicion of murder. But he was in Europe, and in 1933, international law enforcement cooperation was limited at best. Extradition treaties existed but were difficult to enforce. And Podorjay, using his military connections and whatever other resources he had, managed to stay ahead of authorities. He was never apprehended. Some reports suggest he eventually returned to Yugoslavia, where he may have been protected by political or military connections. Other accounts claim he changed his identity and disappeared into another country entirely. The most frustrating possibility is that he simply lived out his life in freedom, never facing consequences for what he did. Agnes Tufferson's body was never recovered. The Atlantic Ocean, particularly in the shipping lanes off New York, is deep, hundreds of feet in many areas. A weighted trunk would have sunk quickly and thoroughly. Even if it eventually broke apart under water pressure or decay, the remains would have been scattered across the ocean floor or consumed by marine life. There was no grave for Agnes, no body to bury, no physical confirmation of her death, though the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Her family held a memorial service. Her law practice was dissolved, her assets distributed. The apartment she'd lived in was rented to someone else. The life she'd built, the career she'd worked so hard to establish, it all just stopped, erased by one man's calculated violence. The case became notorious in New York, one of the most chilling examples of what would later be called the Black Widow or Bluebeard phenomenon, predators who marry victims specifically to murder them. What makes Agnes's story particularly tragic is how close she came to safety. If she had told more people about the specific sailing date, if she had insisted on boarding the ship herself rather than leaving the arrangements to Podorjay, if even one friend had thought to check whether she'd actually departed, any of those small interventions might have saved her life. But she trusted the man she married, and that trust killed her. The steamer trunk itself became a kind of symbol in true crime lore. A reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look most human, who court you and charm you and make you believe you're loved, right up until the moment they destroy you. Ivan Podorjay was never seen in America again. Whether he lived out his life in Europe, whether he killed again, whether he ever felt remorse, those questions will never be answered. Agnes Tufferson disappeared on what should have been the beginning of her honeymoon. Instead, it was the end of everything. The Prodigy's final note. December 7th, 1939. Brookline, Massachusetts. But her story begins in New York. Barbara Newhall Follett was born into the world of letters, into a family where words were currency and literary achievement was the highest aspiration one could pursue. Her father, Wilson Follett, was a respected writer and editor who moved comfortably in the circles of New York's intellectual elite, the kind of man who knew all the right people, attended all the important literary gatherings, understood instinctively how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the publishing world. Her mother, Helen, was educated and cultured, the kind of woman who read to her daughter from the classics before Barbara could even speak coherent sentences, who believed that intelligence was something to be cultivated from birth. From the very beginning, from those earliest days when most children are still learning to form basic words, Barbara was different. Not just bright, Not just one of those precocious children who reads early and asks clever questions. Barbara was genuinely, exceptionally, almost frighteningly gifted in ways that defied normal developmental expectations and challenged everything psychologists thought they understood about childhood cognitive development. She taught herself to read at 3 years old. Not simple picture books with large letters, but actual books with complex sentences and sophisticated vocabulary. By 4, she was writing her own stories. Not the typical rambling narratives of early childhood, but structured tales with beginnings, middles, and ends. By 8, she was composing novels. Not children's stories. Not simple fairy tales with moral lessons. Actual novels with complex plots, fully developed characters, sophisticated vocabulary, and sentence structure that would have been impressive coming from an adult writer with years of experience. Her parents recognized immediately what they had: a genuine prodigy, perhaps one of the most naturally talented young writers America had ever produced. A gift that came along once in a generation, if that. And they nurtured it with obsessive dedication, encouraged it at every turn, structured their entire lives around cultivating Barbara's extraordinary gift. They moved frequently, following opportunities for Wilson's work, but New York was always the center of their orbit, the sun around which their literary ambitions revolved. New York was where publishers had their offices, where editors gathered in clubs and restaurants to discuss the future of American letters, where the literary world made its judgments about who mattered and who would be forgotten. When Barbara was 12 years old, in 1926, she published her first novel, The House Without Windows. The book was extraordinary in ways that left critics and readers struggling for adequate language to describe what they were experiencing. It was a fantasy about a young girl named Heiress who runs away from civilization to live in the wild, progressively shedding the constraints and conventions of human society. With each chapter, Heiress becomes increasingly feral and free, more connected to nature and less bound by human expectations, until, in the final pages, she transforms into something elemental and eternal, escaping human society entirely to become part of the natural world itself. The prose was lyrical, haunting, dreamlike. The metaphors were sophisticated. The themes, freedom versus civilization, the constraints of social expectations, the longing for transcendence, were mature beyond anything a 12-year-old should have been capable of understanding, let alone articulating with such elegant precision. The New York literary world, always hungry for the next sensation, went absolutely wild for it. Book reviewers published lengthy, breathless pieces trying to capture what made Barbara's work so remarkable. Some critics initially suspected it was actually her father's work published under Barbara's name as an elaborate publicity stunt. It wouldn't have been the first time a savvy parent had exploited a child's name for commercial advantage. But personal interviews with Barbara quickly dispelled those doubts. She could discuss her work with the ease and sophistication of a seasoned author who had spent decades refining her craft. She explained her creative choices, discussed her themes and symbolism, articulated her intentions with clarity that proved beyond doubt that the work was genuinely hers. She wasn't a puppet reading lines someone else had written. She was the real thing, a legitimate, undeniable prodigy. A second novel followed when she was 14. The Voyage of the Normandy, another critical success, another demonstration of talents that seemed to defy natural law. Barbara Newhall Follett was hailed as a literary sensation, a once-in-a-generation talent who would surely become one of America's great writers, whose name would eventually be spoken in the same breath as the country's most celebrated author. But genius comes with a price that no one talks about when they're celebrating a child prodigy. The pressure was enormous, crushing, suffocating in ways that are difficult for people who haven't experienced it to fully comprehend. The expectations were impossible. Every new piece of writing was scrutinized not just for its own merits, but in comparison to her earlier work, judged against standards that kept rising, that demanded she not just match, but exceed what she'd already accomplished. She was no longer just Barbara, a young woman trying to figure out who she was and what she wanted from life. She was Barbara Newhall Follett, child prodigy, literary sensation, the girl who had published sophisticated novels before most kids finished elementary school. And as she grew older, as she moved through her teenage years into young adulthood, that prodigy label became less like a gift and more like a cage with bars made of other people's expectations. She was supposed to keep producing, keep being exceptional, keep living up to the promise of those early works that had made her famous. But writing, real writing, the kind that matters and lasts, doesn't work that way. It's not a faucet you can turn on and off at will. It's not a skill you can simply apply on demand whenever it's convenient. It requires inspiration that comes and goes, according to its own mysterious rhythms. It requires mental space that's nearly impossible to maintain when you're constantly being watched and judged. It requires emotional energy that depletes rapidly under pressure. And Barbara was running out of all three. Her parents' marriage fell apart when she was in her teens, dissolving in recriminations and bitterness. Her father left, abandoning the family, and taking much of their financial security with him. Wilson Follett, the sophisticated editor who had introduced his daughter to New York's literary elite, who had nurtured her gift and helped launch her career, simply walked away. The Folletts had never been wealthy. Wilson's income as a writer and editor was respectable, but not substantial. Enough to maintain a comfortable middle-class existence, but nothing approaching real financial security, and his departure left Barbara and her mother struggling in ways they had never experienced before. The money from Barbara's book sales helped, but publishing in the 1920s and 30s didn't make most authors rich. Even successful books often brought modest returns unless they became genuine bestsellers, and Barbara's work, while critically acclaimed, was too literary and unconventional to generate mass market sales. Barbara's own life became increasingly unstable, unmoored from the structures that had defined her childhood. She married young at 18 to a man named Nickerson Rogers. He was someone she had met through literary circles in New York, the social networks her father had introduced her to before he left. It's unclear from historical records whether it was genuine love or something closer to desperation. A desire to escape her mother's household with its memories of her father's abandonment, to establish her own identity separate from the prodigy burden that had defined her entire existence. The marriage was troubled from the start, showing cracks almost immediately. Rogers was charming but unreliable, often unemployed, drifting between jobs with no clear direction or ambition, unable to provide the financial stability that Barbara desperately needed. Barbara took work as a typist and stenographer to support them both. Menial office work that consumed the hours she should have been spending writing, that drained her creative energy and left her exhausted at the end of each day. She tried to write. Desperately, painfully tried. She produced short stories during whatever spare moments she could find and submitted them to magazines that had once celebrated her work. But the rejections piled up, formed letters that offered no explanation or encouragement, just the cold indifference of an industry that had moved on to newer sensations. The literary world that had celebrated her as a child prodigy seemed to have lost interest now that she was an adult struggling like any other writer trying to make a living with words. The novelty had worn off. The 12-year-old literary sensation was now just another 20-something submitting manuscripts that editors glanced at briefly before returning with polite notes about how the work didn't quite fit our current needs. The frustration ate at her like acid. She had been told her entire life that she was special, marked for greatness, blessed with a gift that would carry her to the highest levels of literary achievement that few writers ever reached. She had published 2 novels before she was 15 years old. Critics had written essays about her genius, and now she was typing other people's manuscripts for pennies an hour and getting rejection letters from magazines that wouldn't have existed without the kind of passionate readership her early work had inspired. The disconnect between the promise of her childhood and the reality of her adult life was devastating in ways that left psychological scars that never fully healed. By 1939, Barbara and Nickerson were living in Brookline, Massachusetts, in a small apartment they could barely afford even with both of them working. They had moved from New York, perhaps hoping that distance from the city would somehow ease the pressure, would give Barbara space to rediscover whatever spark had produced those early novels. But geography couldn't solve the fundamental problems in their lives. The marriage was essentially over, held together only by inertia and lack of better options. They fought constantly, about money, about Barbara's inability to get her writing published, about Nickerson's chronic unemployment and lack of ambition, about everything and nothing, the kind of grinding daily conflict that destroys relationships one bitter exchange at a time. Barbara had become withdrawn, depressed in ways that alarmed the few friends who still saw her regularly. The bright, articulate prodigy had been replaced by someone hollowed out, like something vital had been burned away by years of disappointment and pressure, leaving only the shell. Friends who saw her in those final months before her disappearance described her as absent, even when she was physically present, like she was looking at the world from a great distance, disconnected from the life happening around her. On December 7, 1939, Barbara and Nickerson had another fight. The details were never fully clear. Nickerson's account was vague when he spoke to police, possibly deliberately so. Possibly because he genuinely didn't remember the specifics of what had become just another in an endless series of arguments. It was about the usual things. Money they didn't have, opportunities that hadn't materialized, the grinding, daily disappointment of lives that hadn't turned out the way either of them had hoped when they were younger and still believed in possibilities. The argument escalated. Voices were raised. Things were said that couldn't be taken back. Barbara walked out of the apartment that evening, sometime around 8 o'clock. She took $30 in cash, a substantial amount in 1939, equivalent to several $100s in modern currency, enough for several weeks of modest living if you were careful about expenses. She took a notebook, the kind she always carried for writing down observations and story ideas, the habit of a lifetime that she'd never abandoned even when the stories themselves had stopped coming. She was wearing a light coat, inadequate for the December cold that had settled over New England, the kind of oversight that suggests she either wasn't planning to be gone long or she wasn't thinking clearly about practical matters. She told Nickerson she was going for a walk, that she needed to clear her head, to get away from the apartment and the argument and the suffocating sense of failure that permeated every corner of their lives together. She walked out the door into the December evening, and she never came back. Nickerson claimed later that he wasn't immediately worried. They had fought before, and Barbara had left before, usually returning after a few hours once she'd calmed down, and the worst of the anger had dissipated. He went to bed that night, he told police, expecting to find her asleep on the couch in the morning, as had happened several times before after their worst fights. But morning came and Barbara was gone. Her coat wasn't on the hook. Her shoes weren't by the door. There was no note, no indication she'd returned during the night. Nickerson waited another day before contacting anyone. Perhaps he was still expecting her to return, to walk back through the door with some explanation about where she'd been. Perhaps some part of him was relieved she was gone, grateful for the temporary reprieve from the constant conflict. Perhaps he simply didn't know what to do, paralyzed by the implications of reporting his wife missing, of making the disappearance official and permanent. When he finally reported her missing on December 9th, the police response was perfunctory at best. Barbara was an adult. She had left of her own volition, taking money and personal items with her. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of a struggle in the apartment, no indication that she had been forced to leave against her will. It appeared to be a voluntary departure, and in 1939, as today, adults had the legal right to walk away from their lives if they chose to. The investigation was minimal, barely more than a formality. Police checked hospitals and morgues in the immediate Boston area. They interviewed the few friends and acquaintances Barbara had in Brookline, none of whom had seen her since before her disappearance. They contacted her mother in New York, hoping Barbara might have gone there seeking refuge or support. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a telegram. And then the trail went cold, evaporating like morning mist under scrutiny. Barbara's mother, Helen, was devastated in ways that transcended ordinary grief. She traveled to Brookline immediately upon hearing the news, conducting her own search with the desperate energy of a parent who refuses to accept the unacceptable. She walked the streets showing Barbara's photograph to shopkeepers and residents. She put up notices in public places. She contacted everyone she could think of who might have information. Old friends from Barbara's childhood, literary contacts from New York, anyone who might know where Barbara would go if she was running away. Nothing. Nothing. No one had seen her. No one had any information. Helen hired a private investigator when the police stopped actively looking, spending money she couldn't really afford in the desperate hope that a professional might find what she couldn't. The investigator followed every lead Helen could provide, interviewed everyone connected to Barbara's life, and came up with the same result the police had: nothing. Barbara Newhall Follett had walked out of her apartment into a December evening and simply ceased to exist. The theories about what happened to her have multiplied over the decades, becoming more elaborate and speculative with each passing year as the case receded further into history. Some believe she committed suicide, overwhelmed by the weight of her failed promise, her shattered marriage, her grinding poverty, and her inability to write her way out of her circumstances the way she'd once written her way to fame. That she walked to some isolated place. There are plenty of options in New England, plenty of rivers and forests and cliffs where someone determined to end their life could do so in ways that would prevent the body from being easily found. New England in December offers cold water that would claim a body quickly, forests where someone could disappear into the underbrush and not be found for months or years, if ever. Others believe she successfully disappeared, that the $30 in the notebook were enough to start over somewhere far from Massachusetts and New York, far from the people who knew her as Barbara Newhall Follett, child prodigy, failed promise. That she created a new identity, found work under a different name, and lived out her life in anonymity, finally free from the expectations that had suffocated her entire existence. That somewhere, she was waitressing in a small town, or working in a library, or living a quiet, anonymous life, where no one cared whether she ever wrote anything again, where she could simply be a person rather than a symbol. This theory has a romantic appeal. The idea that somewhere, Barbara escaped the cage of her prodigy identity and found peace. That she chose obscurity over the crushing pressure of being herself. But it struggles against practical realities. $30 wouldn't last long, even in 1939. And starting over completely, especially for a woman alone in that era, would have been extraordinarily difficult. Still others believe she met with foul play, that she was vulnerable, a young woman alone at night with visible cash, and that she encountered someone who saw an opportunity for robbery, or worse, that she was attacked, killed, and her body disposed of in a way that prevented discovery. That what seemed like a voluntary disappearance was actually murder that left no trace. This theory struggles against the lack of evidence. There were no reports of suspicious activity that night, no witnesses to an attack, no body ever found despite searches. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and plenty of people disappear into violence that leaves no trace. The theory that her husband, Nickerson Rogers, was involved has also persisted over the decades. His timeline was vague and inconsistent. His delay in reporting her missing was suspicious, and he was the last person known to have seen her alive, the person with the most opportunity to harm her. But the police at the time didn't seriously consider him a suspect, and there's no concrete evidence beyond circumstantial suspicion to support the theory that he killed her. What makes Barbara's disappearance particularly haunting, what gives it a quality that transcends ordinary tragedy, is the symbolism that seems too perfect to be coincidental. Here was a writer who had written at age 12 about a girl who runs away from civilization and transforms into something wild and free, something that transcends and escapes human understanding entirely, becoming part of nature itself. And then, at age 25, Barbara herself disappeared, leaving behind only questions and a notebook that was never found, walking out into winter darkness and vanishing as completely as if she had transformed into air. It's almost too literary, too perfectly constructed, the life mirroring the art in a way that feels deliberate. Like Barbara had been writing her own ending all along, like the story she told at 12 was actually prophecy rather than fiction. But that's probably just us imposing narrative structure on chaos, looking for meaning and patterns in something that might have been nothing more than a tragedy of mental illness, or bad luck, or bad timing, or simply a woman who decided she'd had enough of the life she was living and walked away from it without fully thinking through the consequences. Barbara's mother continued searching for her daughter for the rest of her life, never giving up hope even as years turned to decades. Helen Follett never accepted that Barbara was truly gone. She followed up on every rumored sighting, every hint that someone matching Barbara's description had been seen somewhere. A librarian in Oregon, a waitress in California, a woman living quietly in a small Midwestern town. She contacted police departments across the country. She maintained correspondence with anyone who had known Barbara. She never stopped hoping for a phone call, a letter, some confirmation that her daughter was alive somewhere, even if Barbara never wanted to come home. Helen died in the 1960s, never knowing what happened to Barbara, carrying that unanswered question to her grave. Barbara Newhall Follett was declared legally dead in 1948, 7 years after her disappearance, the standard waiting period in most jurisdictions for someone missing without any contact or confirmed sighting. But legal death isn't the same as knowing someone is dead. It's just a bureaucratic acknowledgement that they've been gone long enough, that the world needs to move on, that estates need to be settled and legal matters resolved even in the absence of certainty. Her books, those remarkable novels she wrote as a child, have been republished in recent years, rediscovered by new generations of readers who are astounded by what she accomplished at such a young age. Literary scholars have written lengthy analyses of her work, trying to understand the mind that could produce such sophisticated writing before most people have finished their basic education. Universities teach her novels and courses on American literature and child prodigies. But the woman who wrote those books is gone, and no one knows where or why, or what happened in those final hours after she walked out into the December cold. There's a particular cruelty in Barbara's story that makes it difficult to think about without feeling a sense of profound injustice. She was celebrated as a prodigy, told she was special and gifted, raised to believe her talent would carry her through life and bring her success and fulfillment. And then, when the gift didn't translate into adult success, when the literary world moved on to newer sensations, and the promise didn't materialize into the expected glorious career, she was left with nothing but the crushing weight of failed expectations and the knowledge that she had somehow fallen short of what she was supposed to be. And so she walked away, into winter, darkness, into silence that has never been broken, and she never came back. The Student at the Riverside, December 30th, 2011. Manhattan, Harlem. By 2011, the world had changed in ways Barbara Newhall Follett could never have imagined. The age of digital surveillance, GPS tracking, cell phone triangulation, security cameras on every corner capturing every movement. The kind of pervasive technology that should theoretically make it impossible for someone to simply disappear in a major city without leaving some kind of trace, some digital breadcrumb that investigators could follow. And yet, Ian Burnett was 21 years old, a mechanical engineering student at McGill University in Montreal. He was Scottish, originally from the Edinburgh area, but he'd been studying in Canada for several years, working toward his degree with the kind of focused determination that suggested he'd planned his life carefully and knew exactly where he was headed. By all accounts, from friends and professors, he was a good student, not exceptional or brilliant, but solid, reliable. The kind of person who showed up for classes, completed his assignments on time, and would probably go on to have a successful career in engineering once he graduated. He was intelligent, friendly, socially well-adjusted. The kind of young man who kept in regular touch with his family back in Scotland, who showed up for his commitments, who didn't take unnecessary risks or engage in reckless behavior. Not the type to disappear. Not the type you'd ever worry about in that particular way. For the winter holidays, Ian had traveled to New York City to celebrate New Year's with friends. He was staying in an apartment in Harlem, near Riverside Drive and 139th Street, a neighborhood that had gentrified significantly in recent years, but still retained pockets of the grittiness and authenticity that had defined it in earlier, harder decades. The apartment belonged to friends, other students, young people in their early 20s who had gathered in New York for the traditional New Year's celebration, drawn by the excitement of being in the city for the ball drop in Times Square, the sense that anything was possible in the final hours of one year and the first hours of the next. December 30th was unusually mild for late December in New York. Temperature in the low 40s, no snow on the ground. Overcast, but not raining. The kind of weather that made walking around the city bearable, even pleasant if you were dressed appropriately with a decent jacket. Ian spent the day with his friends, making plans for New Year's Eve the following night, exploring the neighborhood, visiting local shops and restaurants, doing the things young people do when they're in a city that feels full of possibility and adventure. There was no indication that anything was wrong. No signs of distress or unusual behavior. Ian seemed happy, relaxed, looking forward to the celebrations. Around 10:30 p.m., Ian told his friends he was going to step out for a bit. He didn't specify where he was going or what he planned to do. He didn't say he was meeting anyone or heading to any particular destination. The impression his friends got was that he was just going for a walk, maybe to clear his head after a day spent mostly indoors, maybe to get some air before sleeping, maybe just to wander for a bit and see the neighborhood at night. He left his cell phone in the apartment. Just left it sitting on a table or a couch, didn't take it with him. He left his wallet with his ID and credit cards and whatever cash he'd been carrying. He took nothing with him except the clothes he was wearing. Jeans, a jacket, shoes. No phone, no wallet, no identification of any kind. His friends assumed he'd be back in a few minutes, maybe half an hour at most. It was late, getting close to 11 o'clock, and they had big plans for the next evening. No one thought anything of it. People step out for air all the time, especially in a crowded apartment with multiple people sharing limited space. Ian walked out of the apartment building into the Harlem night. He never came back. When an hour passed, then 2, then 3, his friends started to worry. They tried calling his cell phone before remembering it was still in the apartment, sitting right where he'd left it. They checked local bars and restaurants within walking distance, thinking maybe he'd stopped somewhere to grab a drink or a snack and had lost track of time. They walked around the immediate neighborhood, looking for him on the streets, calling his name. Nothing. No sign of him. No one they asked had seen anyone matching his description. By morning, December 31st, New Year's Eve, when Ian still hadn't returned and hadn't contacted anyone, when it became clear that something was genuinely wrong, his friends called the NYPD. The police response was immediate and extensive. A young foreign tourist missing in New York, last seen in Harlem, with no phone and no wallet. That was serious. That suggested either something had happened to him or he was in some kind of acute mental health crisis. Either scenario required urgent action. Then MPD deployed search teams across Harlem and the surrounding areas. They focused heavily on Riverside Park, the massive green space that runs along the Hudson River from the Upper West Side through Harlem and beyond. The park was just a few blocks from where Ian had been staying, easily within walking distance, and it was a logical place for someone to go if they wanted to be near the water, or just wanted to walk somewhere that felt less urban. Riverside Park in winter is beautiful, but potentially treacherous in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The paths wind through dense vegetation, bare trees in December, but still thick underbrush in many areas that could hide someone lying injured or unconscious. There are steep slopes down to the water's edge, rocky areas where someone could slip and fall and not be easily visible from the main paths. And there's the river itself, dark and cold and always moving, the Hudson carrying its eternal flow down to the harbor and out to sea. Search and rescue teams, including canine units, specifically trained to locate missing persons, combed through Riverside Park methodically for days. They searched the waterline, walking the edges where land met river. They searched the paths, both the main paved walkways and the smaller dirt trails that branched off into more isolated areas. They checked every structure in the park, maintenance buildings, public restrooms, shelters, any place where someone might have taken refuge from the cold. Nothing. No trace of Ian. No clothing, no belongings, no signs of a struggle or an accident. Then MIPD also reviewed security camera footage from the area around the apartment building and the surrounding streets, hoping to track Ian's movements after he left. They found nothing useful. Either the cameras didn't cover the specific areas where Ian had walked, or he had moved in directions that weren't monitored, or the footage quality was too poor to identify individuals in the winter darkness with any certainty. They checked the subway system extensively, thinking maybe Ian had gotten on a train and gone somewhere else in the city, maybe to Times Square or another neighborhood. But without his MetroCard, which was in his wallet back in the apartment, there was no record of him entering the system through any turnstile. It's possible to jump turnstiles without paying, but that would be risky and out of character for someone like Ian, and there was no evidence he'd done so. They checked hospitals and emergency rooms across all 5 boroughs, thinking maybe Ian had been in an accident or experienced some kind of medical emergency and had been brought in unconscious or unable to identify himself. They checked the morgue, dreading what they might find, but knowing it was necessary. They contacted the Port Authority to see if Ian had somehow tried to leave the city via bus or train terminal, though without identification or money that seemed unlikely. Nothing. No hits anywhere. No sightings. No body. No trace. Ian Burnett had walked out of an apartment building in Harlem with nothing but the clothes on his back and vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, as if he'd stepped through some invisible portal into another dimension. His family in Scotland was notified within days of his disappearance. His father, desperate for answers and unwilling to trust the search to others, no matter how competent they were, flew to New York to assist with the search efforts, to press the police to keep looking, to do anything and everything he could to find his son. The anguish of flying across the Atlantic Ocean, not knowing if your child is alive or dead, not knowing if they're injured somewhere needing help or if they're already beyond help. It's something no parent should ever have to experience. The search continued for weeks. The case received significant media coverage, both in New York and internationally. Volunteers joined the police efforts, combing through Riverside Park and other areas where Ian might have gone. Flyers with Ian's photo and physical description were posted throughout Harlem and the Upper West Side, in shop windows and on telephone poles, anywhere they might catch someone's attention. The Scottish community in New York rallied to support the search efforts, but as days turned to weeks and weeks, turned to months with no new information, the active search gradually wound down. There were no new leads to follow, no credible sightings despite all the publicity, no evidence to suggest where Ian had gone or what had happened to him. The investigation remained open. Technically, it still is, but the intensive daily search efforts had to end eventually. Police resources are finite, and without new information to pursue, there is a limit to how long an active search can be sustained. The theories about what happened to Ian were limited, and all of them were deeply disturbing in their implications. The most obvious and frequently discussed theory was that Ian had gone to Riverside Park and somehow ended up in the Hudson River. The park's waterfront is not uniformly safe or well maintained. There are areas with steep drops from the path down to the water level, rocky edges, places where the barrier between land and water is minimal or non-existent. If Ian had walked too close to the edge in the darkness, if he'd slipped on ice or wet rocks that are treacherous year-round, if he'd misjudged his footing in an area without railings, he could have fallen into the river. The Hudson in late December is brutally, lethally cold. Water temperature typically in the low 40s Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause rapid hypothermia, cold enough that even a strong swimmer would lose motor control and consciousness within minutes of immersion. If Ian had fallen in, especially at night when visibility was poor, and there were few people around to see or hear, his chances of survival would have been essentially zero, even if he was an excellent swimmer. Bodies that go into the Hudson don't always surface, or if they do, they can drift for miles before being discovered, carried by the current downstream toward the harbor. The Hudson has strong currents, particularly in the deeper channels. A body could be carried far from where it entered the water, making recovery extremely difficult, even when searchers know approximately where to look. Bodies can also become caught in debris. Submerged tree branches, discarded construction materials, anything that's been dumped in the river over the years. Or they can sink in the deeper sections and never resurface, settling into the mud and silt at the bottom where they'll remain indefinite. Then NYPD conducted extensive searches of the river using boats equipped with sonar and divers trained in underwater recovery. But the Hudson is vast, deep in many sections, and notoriously murky. Visibility underwater is often measured in inches rather than feet. Finding a body in those conditions is extraordinarily difficult, even when you have a good idea of where to look. And in Ian's case, they didn't even have that. They had to search miles of riverfront, based on nothing more than the guess that he'd gone to the park, and somehow ended up in the water. Another theory, one that his friends and family found difficult to accept, but that investigators had to consider, was that Ian had experienced some kind of acute mental health crisis, that he was suffering from depression or anxiety, that he'd successfully hidden from everyone who knew him, and that on the night of December 30th, something triggered a breakdown. People experiencing severe mental health crises sometimes engage in behaviors that seem inexplicable to observers, wandering away from familiar places, shedding possessions and connections, seeking isolation. The fact that Ian left without his phone and wallet could potentially fit this pattern, though it could also simply mean he thought he'd be gone for just a few minutes. But there was no evidence that Ian was struggling mentally. His friends described him as stable, happy, enthusiastic about his studies and his future. His family insisted he had no history of depression or anxiety, no previous episodes that might have suggested vulnerability to a breakdown. He had concrete plans for New Year's Eve the next night. He was engaged with his life. If he was in crisis, he hid it completely from everyone around him. A darker theory that investigators couldn't ignore was foul play, that Ian encountered someone with bad intentions, a robbery that turned violent, a random attack, an abduction. Harlem, in 2011, was far safer than it had been in previous decades, the product of 20 years of declining crime rates across New York City. But violent crime still occurred. A young man walking alone late at night, without a phone to call for help, potentially disoriented in an unfamiliar neighborhood. He could have been vulnerable to robbery or assault. But again, there was no evidence. No witnesses to an attack, despite the fact that Harlem still had plenty of people on the streets at 10:30 p.m., even in late December. No reports of suspicious activity in the area that night. No body that might have shown signs of violence. Just absence where there should have been presence. The theory that haunts his family most, the one that keeps them searching and hoping even now more than a decade later, is the simplest and simultaneously the most inexplicable. That Ian simply walked away. That for reasons known only to him, he decided to leave his life behind. That he's out there somewhere, alive, living under a different identity, and that someday they might get a phone call or a knock on the door. But this theory struggles against everything we know about Ian's character and circumstances. He was close to his family, maintaining regular contact across international distances. He had no apparent reason to disappear. No debts, no conflicts, no scandals or secrets that might have motivated flight. He was happy in his studies, looking forward to his future. And most crucially, he left without his phone and wallet. No way to access money, no identification, nothing that would make starting a new life even remotely practical in the modern world, where you need ID for almost everything. The case remains open. Ian Burnett is still officially listed as a missing person by the NYPD. His family has never stopped searching, never stopped hoping for information that might explain what happened, or at least provide some closure. His father returns to New York periodically, walking the same areas Ian might have walked, distributing new flyers, talking to homeless individuals who live in Riverside Park and might have seen something, keeping his son's memory alive in a city that has long since moved on to newer tragedies and concerns. There's something particularly cruel and frustrating about modern disappearances like Ian's. We live in an age of unprecedented surveillance and connectivity, where almost everyone carries a device that tracks their location constantly, where security cameras record our movements through public spaces, where digital breadcrumbs trace our activities and interactions. It should be impossible to vanish without leaving some kind of trail. Some evidence of where you went and what happened. And yet Ian Burnett, like Dorothy Arnold, a century before him in a completely different technological era, walked into New York City and disappeared so completely that years of investigation employing modern technology and forensic techniques have produced essentially nothing. No answers, no closure, no resolution. Just an empty space where a person used to be, and family members who will spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened in those final hours, constructing and reconstructing scenarios in their minds, unable to grieve properly because grief requires knowing what you're grieving for. Every December 30th, Ian's family marks another year of not knowing. Another year of hope slowly calcifying into something harder and more painful, but never quite becoming acceptance, because how do you accept something when you don't know what you're accepting? How do you mourn someone when you don't know if they're dead? How do you move forward when part of you is still standing in that moment 12 years ago, waiting for your son to walk back through the door? Ian Burnett walked out of an apartment building in Harlem on December 30th, 2011, intending to be gone for a few minutes, and the city swallowed him whole, as completely as the Atlantic swallowed Agnes Tuverson's steamer trunk, leaving nothing behind but questions that echo endlessly through the winter dark. The Graveyard by the Sea, December 11th, 2010. Ocean Parkway, Long Island. The barrier islands of Long Island are desolate in winter. Narrow strips of sand and scrub grass separating the Atlantic Ocean from the Great South Bay. They're popular in summer. Beach towns, seafood restaurants, weekend getaways for New Yorkers seeking escape from the city. But in December, they're abandoned, windswept, silent except for the crash of waves and the cry of seabirds. Ocean Parkway runs the length of Jones Beach Island and Oak Beach, a long straight road flanked by sand dunes and marsh grass. In winter, there's almost no traffic. No reason to be out there unless you live in one of the small year-round communities, or you're looking for isolation. On December 11th, 2010, Suffolk County Police Officer John Malia was looking for something specific. He was searching for Shannon Gilbert. Shannon was a 24-year-old woman who had disappeared 6 months earlier, in May 2010, in the gated community of Oak Beach. She had been working as an escort, meeting a client in one of the beach houses. But something had gone wrong. In the early morning hours, Shannon had made a frantic 911 call, telling the dispatcher that someone was trying to kill her, that she needed help. The call lasted over 20 minutes. Shannon was audibly terrified, running, hiding, convinced she was in danger. And then the call ended. She had run out of the gated community into the darkness surrounding Oak Beach and vanished. The initial police response had been confused and inadequate. By the time officers arrived, Shannon was gone. The client claimed nothing had happened, that she had simply left. The homeowner was uncooperative, and the police, treating it as a possible dispute over payment rather than a genuine emergency, didn't mount an extensive immediate search. Shannon's family had been fighting for months to get law enforcement to take her disappearance seriously. They had hired their own investigators. They had conducted their own searches of the area around Oak Beach. They had pushed and pleaded and demanded that someone look for their daughter. And finally, in December, the Suffolk County Police Department organized a proper search. Officer John Malia was part of that search team. He was paired with Blue, a cadaver dog trained to detect human remains. They were walking along Ocean Parkway, moving slowly through the dense brush that flanked the road. Blue sniffing methodically, Malia watching for any sign that the dog had picked up a scent. Around midday, less than half a mile east of Oak Beach, Blue alerted. He had found something in the brush, maybe 10 feet off the roadway, hidden in the tall beach grass and scrub vegetation that no one had any reason to push through. Malia approached carefully, pushing aside the brown, winter-dead grass. What he found wasn't Shannon Gilbert. It was a burlap sack, and inside the sack, wrapped tightly, were human remains. Skeletal. Female. The body had been there long enough that the soft tissue was mostly gone, leaving bones and leathery remnants of skin. Malia immediately called for backup and secured the scene. This was now a crime scene, a homicide investigation. But it was also just the beginning. Over the next 2 days, as search teams expanded their coverage of the area, they found 3 more bodies, all within a quarter-mile stretch of Ocean Parkway, all hidden in the dense brush just off the roadway, all wrapped in burlap and positioned in almost identical ways, lying parallel to the road, about 10 to 15 feet into the vegetation. All female, all skeletal. All had been there for months, possibly years. By December 13th, investigators had recovered 4 bodies. The Gilgo 4, as they would come to be known, named after Gilgo Beach, the closest landmark to where they were found. The autopsies and forensic analysis would take time, but the identities were eventually established through dental records and DNA. Maureen Brainard Barnstable, 25 years old, missing since July 2007. Last seen in Manhattan, working as an escort. Melissa Barthélemy, 24 years old, missing since July 2009. Also worked as an escort in New York City. Megan Waterman, 22 years old, missing since June 2010. Had been working in the escort trade in Long Island in Maine. Amber Lynn Costello, 27 years old, missing since September 2010. Had been living in West Babylon, working as an escort. 4 women, all involved in the escort business. All had advertised their services on Craigslist and other online platforms. All had disappeared over a span of 3 years without anyone realizing they were connected. And all had been murdered by the same person, or at least disposed of by the same person in the same manner. The burial method was distinctive and deeply unsettling. Burlap sacks aren't commonly used anymore. They're an old-fashioned material, mostly replaced by plastic and synthetic fabrics. Someone had gone to the effort of obtaining burlap sacks large enough to hold human bodies, wrapping the victims carefully and transporting them to this desolate stretch of road. The placement was equally deliberate. Each body was positioned parallel to the road, approximately the same distance into the brush, spaced out over a quarter-mile. This wasn't random dumping. This was organized, methodical. The work of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what they were doing. The location itself told a story. Ocean Parkway in winter is one of the most isolated areas in the New York metropolitan region. At night, you could drive for miles without seeing another car. You could pull over, drag a body into the brush, and be gone within minutes with virtually no risk of being seen. And the barrier island landscape, windswept, constantly changing with storms and erosion, would help conceal the remains. The salt air and sandy soil would accelerate decomposition. Wildlife would scatter bones. The dense vegetation would hide everything until winter stripped the cover away. The killer had chosen this location carefully, and they had used it multiple times over several years, confident that the bodies would remain hidden. The discovery of the Gilgo 4 triggered a massive investigation. The FBI joined the Suffolk County Police. Profilers analyzed the crime scenes, trying to build a psychological portrait of the killer. Detectives began the painstaking work of reconstructing the victims' final days, trying to identify who they had been in contact with, where they had gone, who might have been the last person to see them alive. The investigation expanded beyond the initial 4 bodies. Search teams continued combing Ocean Parkway and the surrounding areas, and they found more remains. By the spring of 2011, a total of 10 bodies, including partial remains, had been recovered from the Gilgo Beach area. Not all of them were connected to the same killer. Some appeared to be unrelated cases, bodies that had been dumped in the same general area by different perpetrators taking advantage of the isolation. But the 4 original victims, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Air, were definitely connected. The same MO, the same disposal method, the same victimology. The profile of the killer that emerged was chilling in its calculation. This was someone who targeted vulnerable women. Escorts are ideal victims from a predator's perspective. They advertise themselves online, often working independently without security, willing to meet strangers in isolated locations, and when they disappear, the response from law enforcement is often minimal. Society's prejudices against these women mean their disappearances don't get the same attention as other missing persons cases. The killer used this to their advantage. They contacted victims through online platforms, arranged meetings, and then murdered them. How they killed them wasn't clear. The decomposition was too advanced to determine cause of death in most cases. But the murders were efficient enough to leave minimal evidence. And then the bodies were driven to Ocean Parkway and disposed of in this carefully chosen dumping ground. The investigation identified persons of interest. Detectives looked at people who lived in the area, who had connections to the escort trade, who had the means and opportunity to commit these crimes. But building a prosecutable case proved extraordinarily difficult. The crime scenes had been exposed to the elements for months or years. DNA evidence was degraded or contaminated. The victims' final hours were difficult to reconstruct because they had been involved in transactions that were inherently secretive. The case went cold, frustrating investigators and devastating the victims' families. But it never truly closed. New leads emerged periodically. New technologies allowed for reanalysis of evidence, and investigators never stopped believing they could identify the killer. In July 2023, nearly 13 years after the discovery of the Gilgo 4, Suffolk County Police arrested a suspect, Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect living in Massapequa Park, Long Island. Married with children. Outwardly normal, boring even. The kind of person neighbors described as unremarkable. He was charged with multiple counts of murder in connection with the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. The evidence against him included DNA recovered from the crime scenes, cell phone records placing him in the vicinity of the victim's last known locations, and internet search history that was both damning and disturbing. Heuermann had allegedly been researching escorts online, searching for information about the Gilgo Beach investigation, looking up details about how long it takes for bodies to decompose, and viewing content related to torture and violence. The arrest brought some measure of closure to the families, though Heuermann has maintained his innocence and the case is ongoing as of this writing. But what the arrest confirmed was what investigators had believed all along. The Gilgo 4 had been murdered by a serial killer who had operated for years without detection, who had chosen his victims carefully, and who had used the isolated landscape of Long Island's Barrier Islands as his personal graveyard. And it was winter that finally revealed what he had hidden. The same seasonal change that stripped the leaves from the brambles in Alipon Park, revealing Rajwinder Kaur's body, had made the Ocean Parkway brush thin enough for Officer Malia and his cadaver dog to find what summer had concealed. 4 women who had been missing for years. 4 families who had been searching and hoping and grieving without answers. 4 lives reduced to bones and burlap, hidden in the beach grass like discarded trash. The December cold that made the search possible was the same cold that had allowed the killer to work undetected. The same isolation that made Ocean Parkway a good dumping ground, made it a terrible place for someone to be taken against their will. Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their lives, complicated, imperfect, but valuable, deserve to be acknowledged as more than just victims of a serial killer. They were daughters, sisters, friends, human beings who deserve safety and dignity and justice. And for more than a decade, they lay forgotten in the winter grass, waiting for someone to find them. The Body in the Brambles. July 2012. December 4th, 2012. Queens, Hollis Hills. Rajwinder Kaur was a social worker, a profession that attracts a particular kind of person, someone who sees suffering and feels compelled to help rather than to look away. Someone who can face the darkest aspects of human existence and still believe that intervention matters, that individual actions can make a difference in lives that seem overwhelmed by circumstance. She worked with some of the most vulnerable populations in New York, people struggling with severe mental illness, poverty that ground them down daily, addiction that had destroyed their ability to function, domestic violence that trapped them in cycles of abuse. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work that most people couldn't sustain long-term. The compassion fatigue is real and crushing. The burnout rate for social workers is extraordinarily high, with most leaving the field within 5 years because the weight of other people's trauma becomes unbearable. But Rajwinder had found meaning in it, found purpose in being the person who showed up when no one else would, who advocated for people the system had written off, who saw human beings worthy of help where others saw lost causes. She was in her mid-40s, married, living in the Hollis Hills neighborhood of Queens with her family. It was a quiet, solidly middle-class residential area. Tree-lined streets with modest single-family homes. Good schools. The kind of place where people raised families and knew their neighbors and felt safe. Not the kind of neighborhood where you expected tragedy. Not the kind of place where people disappeared. On a day in July 2012, the exact date was never firmly established, which would become part of the investigation's ongoing challenge. Rajwinder told her family she was going to buy a dress for an upcoming family wedding. It was a simple, mundane errand, the kind of ordinary task that fills everyday life. She needed something appropriate for the celebration, and she was going to go shopping. She took her purse with her wallet and identification. She took her phone. She took her car keys. She drove away from her house that afternoon, and she never came home. When she didn't return that evening, her husband initially contacted family and friends, thinking maybe she'd stopped somewhere. Maybe she'd run into someone she knew and had gotten caught up in conversation. Maybe her plans had changed and she'd forgotten to call. But Rajwinder was reliable, responsible, the kind of person who always let people know if her plans changed. She would have called if something had come up. By the next morning, when she still hadn't appeared and hadn't made any contact with anyone, when calls to her phone went straight to voicemail suggesting it was either turned off or dead, her family knew something was seriously wrong and went to the police. Then NYPD took the missing persons report and began a standard investigation. They checked hospitals and accident reports across the 5 boroughs and surrounding areas, thinking maybe she'd been in a car accident and was unconscious or unable to identify herself. They attempted to ping her cell phone for location data, but it was either turned off or the battery had died, providing no useful information. They reviewed her bank accounts and credit cards looking for activity, purchases, ATM withdrawals, anything that might indicate where she'd gone. There was nothing. No activity after the day she disappeared. They found her car relatively quickly, which initially seemed like a promising development. It was parked on a residential street in Hollis Hills, not far from her home, maybe a mile or so from where she lived. The car was locked, completely undamaged, with no signs of a struggle or forced entry. Inside, her purse remained on the passenger seat with her wallet and credit card still inside. Completely undisturbed. Her phone was gone, though it was never found or traced to any location. The discovery of the car raised more questions than it answered. Why would Rajwinder park her car and then go somewhere on foot, leaving her purse behind? Was she meeting someone who had asked her to come to that specific location? Had she parked there because it was close to a store? She planned to visit and intended to come right back. But there were no stores in that immediate area that sold dresses. No obvious reason for her to have parked there. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood extensively, going door to door, showing Rajwinder's photo to local business owners and residents, asking if anyone had seen her or noticed anything unusual. Some people thought they might have seen her, vague recollections of a woman who maybe looked like the photo, but the sightings were unconfirmed, imprecise, ultimately unhelpful in determining where she'd gone after parking the car. The investigation hit wall after wall. There were no witnesses to an abduction or any kind of confrontation. No evidence of foul play at the car or anywhere else. No activity on her financial accounts. No communication from Rajwinder to anyone. No phone calls, no texts, no emails, no social media activity. She had simply vanished. Her family refused to accept that she had disappeared without explanation. They organized their own extensive search efforts, printing thousands of flyers with Rajwinder's photo and physical description and distributing them across Queens, posting them on telephone poles and in store windows and anywhere else they might catch someone's attention. They created social media pages dedicated to finding her, sharing information and coordinating volunteer searches. They walked the neighborhoods around where her car had been found, talking to people, looking in parks and wooded areas, searching for any trace of where she might have gone. For months, the search consumed them. Every day without answers was another day of torture, another day of not knowing whether Rajwinder was alive somewhere and needed help, or whether she was already gone, and they were searching for remains rather than a living person. The summer turned to fall, the leaves changing color and beginning to drop. The temperature declined gradually. The days grew shorter, darkness coming earlier each evening. The vegetation that had been lush and green in July began to die back, the annual cycle of decay that precedes winter dormancy. And on December 4th, 2012, nearly 5 months after Rajwinder disappeared, a maintenance worker at Ali Pond Park made a discovery that ended the family's agonizing wait for answers. Ali Pond Park is one of Queens' largest green spaces, covering over 650 acres of diverse terrain, forests, wetlands, meadows, hiking trails. It's a genuine wilderness area in the middle of urban New York, close enough to residential neighborhoods that people use it regularly for recreation, but large enough and wild enough that there are sections where you can be truly isolated, where the sounds of the city fade away and you're surrounded by nothing but trees and undergrowth. In the summer, the vegetation in much of the park is dense, almost impenetrable in some areas. Thick brush and tall grasses that create natural barriers, hiding whatever lies within. You can walk within feet of something and never see it if it's concealed in the right kind of undergrowth. But winter changes the landscape dramatically. The leaves fall from the deciduous trees and shrubs. The underbrush dies back, leaving bare branches and open sightlines. The ground becomes visible again, exposed in ways it isn't during the growing season. The maintenance worker was clearing debris in a heavily wooded section of the park, an area well off the main trails where park visitors rarely ventured, accessible only by pushing through thick undergrowth. He was doing routine cleanup, removing fallen branches and accumulated trash that hikers had discarded or that had blown in from surrounding areas. The winter thinning of the foliage had revealed something that summer had kept hidden. A body, partially decomposed and partially skeletonized, lying in the brambles and dead leaves, concealed beneath what had been thick vegetation months earlier. It was Rajwinder Kaur. The discovery brought her family the closure they had desperately sought. But closure is a complicated word that doesn't mean what most people think it means. Knowing that someone you love is dead is somehow both better and worse than not knowing. The uncertainty ends, which provides a certain relief. At least you're not wondering anymore, not holding on to hope that becomes more painful with each passing day. But the grief solidifies into something permanent and inescapable. The possibility that she might still be alive, that she might walk back into their lives someday with an explanation, that's gone forever, replaced by the absolute certainty of loss. The suicide theory emerged almost immediately and became one of the primary investigative focuses. Rajwinder worked in mental health, dealing constantly with trauma and human suffering and tragedy. She listened to people's worst experiences day after day. She tried to help people who were often resistant to help, who were trapped in circumstances that seemed impossible to escape. The burnout rate for social workers is extremely high, precisely because the work is so emotionally demanding. The compassion fatigue, the gradual erosion of empathy and emotional responsiveness that comes from constant exposure to suffering, is a documented occupational hazard. Had Rajwinder been struggling with depression that she'd hidden from her family? Had the weight of her work finally become too much to bear? Had she reached a breaking point where ending her life seemed like the only escape from the accumulated trauma she carried? The location was consistent with this theory. Ali Pond Park is large enough and isolated enough that someone seeking privacy to end their life could find it. And the absence of obvious trauma was consistent with methods like overdose or poisoning that would be difficult or impossible to detect after significant decomposition. But her family rejected this theory completely and emphatically. They insisted Rajwinder had shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation in the days and weeks before her disappearance. She had been looking forward to the family wedding. She had plans and commitments. She was engaged with her life, active with her family, and crucially, she was a mental health professional. If she had been struggling psychologically, wouldn't she have recognized the signs and sought help? Wouldn't she have known where to turn? The murder theory was equally plausible, given the circumstances, and equally difficult to prove without more forensic evidence. Perhaps someone had lured Rajwinder to the park under false pretenses. Maybe someone she knew, maybe even someone from her work. Perhaps a client or a family member of a client who blamed her for something, who harbored a grudge related to her professional role. Social workers sometimes make decisions that anger the people they're trying to help, and that anger can occasionally turn into genuine threats. Perhaps she had agreed to meet someone she trusted in what seemed like a safe public location, and that person had attacked her, killed her in a way that left minimal physical evidence. So strangulation, suffocation, poisoning, any method that wouldn't necessarily show up on skeletal remains, and then dragged or carried her body into the dense brush where it wouldn't be found during the summer months when the park was most heavily used by hikers and families. The problem with the murder theory was the complete and frustrating absence of evidence pointing to any specific suspect. Detectives investigated Rajwinder's professional life extensively, going through her case files with permission from her employer, looking for disgruntled clients or threatening situations, interviewing people she'd worked with to see if anyone stood out as having both motive and opportunity. They found nothing conclusive. Social work involves difficult cases and sometimes angry, frustrated people who blame their social workers for decisions that affect their lives. But there was no specific threat on record against Rajwinder. No individual who stood out from the background noise as someone who might have escalated from anger to violence. They investigated her personal life, her marriage, her finances, her relationships with extended family and friends. Again, nothing. By all accounts, her life was stable and happy. No affairs, no major debts, no hidden conflicts that might have motivated violence against her. No reason anyone could identify for someone to want her dead. The case stalled. Without a clear cause of death, and without evidence pointing to a specific suspect or even a specific theory of what happened, there was nowhere productive for the investigation to go. Then NYPD kept the case officially open, but the active investigation wound down as detectives were reassigned to newer cases with better leads. Rajwinder's death was filed away with thousands of other unsolved cases, tragedies that the system couldn't explain or resolve satisfactorily. Her family finally held a funeral, able at last to lay her body to rest with proper ceremony and the support of their community. But the questions remained unanswered and seemingly unanswerable. What makes Rajwinder's case particularly haunting is the role that seasonal change played in its resolution. Her body had been lying in Alipon Park since July, just a few hundred yards from trails that hundreds of people walk during the summer months. Families with children, joggers, dog walkers, bird watchers. The park was actively used throughout the summer, with people passing relatively close to where she lay. But the dense summer vegetation, the thick green brush, the tall grasses, the leafy undergrowth, had hidden her completely. You could have walked within 10 feet of her body and never seen it, never had any indication that anything was wrong or out of place. It took winter, the death of the leaves, the thinning of the brush, the seasonal dieback that strips away concealment, to reveal what had been there all along, hidden in plain sight for months. In a perverse way, winter gave her family answers. Not the answers they wanted, not the explanations they needed to understand why this had happened, but at least the basic answer of where she was. The confirmation that their desperate search was over, that Rajwinder wasn't out there somewhere needing help that would never come, that the uncertainty could finally end. There's a particular cruelty in cases like Rajwinder's. She was a dedicated social worker, someone who spent her professional life helping others, advocating for the vulnerable, showing up for people when no one else would. And she ended up dead in a park with no clear explanation, no justice, no closure for her family beyond the bare fact of her death. The same system she worked within, law enforcement, medical examiners, the entire apparatus of investigation and justice, couldn't provide her family with even the basic answer of what happened. Couldn't determine if she took her own life in despair, or if someone took it from her. Couldn't identify a suspect if it was murder. Couldn't provide the kind of resolution that might have allowed her family to truly grieve and move forward. Did she walk into those woods alone on that July day, overwhelmed by demons and pressures her family never saw? Or did someone take her there? Someone who knew the park well enough to know that summer would hide their crime until it was too late for forensic evidence to tell the story. We'll never know. And that uncertainty is its own kind of torture for the people left behind. What we do know is that Rajwinder Kaur disappeared on a summer day in July, and winter revealed what autumn had kept hidden. And somewhere in Queens, someone knows what really happened. Whether that person is still alive, whether they carry guilt or indifference, whether they wake up in the night remembering what they did or saw, whether they'll ever face consequences, Those questions remain open, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. The body in the brambles had a name, had a family who loved her, had a life dedicated to helping others, to making the world marginally better through small acts of advocacy and compassion. And she deserved better than an undetermined cause of death and an unsolved case file gathering dust in some precinct storage room. But sometimes, that's all the city gives you. Sometimes the answers never come. And sometimes winter reveals the body but not the truth. The Snowstorm Abduction. January 2nd, 2014. Williamsburg, Brooklyn. If you were in New York City in early January 2014, you remember the polar vortex, a massive Arctic air that descended on the eastern United States, bringing temperatures that hadn't been seen in decades. Wind chills in New York dropped to near zero. The city essentially froze. And on January 2nd, a massive snowstorm rolled in. Heavy, wet snow that fell in thick sheets, accumulating quickly, covering everything in white. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The streets became treacherous. Most people stayed inside, watching the snow pile up, waiting for it to pass. But some people had to go out. Had work that couldn't wait. Had obligations that demanded they venture into the storm. Menachem Stark was one of them. He was 39 years old, a Hasidic Jewish real estate developer who owned multiple properties in Brooklyn. He lived in Williamsburg, the heart of one of the largest Hasidic communities in the United States, a neighborhood where tradition and faith governed daily life. Menachem had an office on Rutledge Street in Williamsburg, a modest building where he ran his real estate business. On January 2nd, despite the blizzard, he went to the office. He had paperwork to handle, calls to make, business that he felt couldn't be postponed even for the weather. He worked late into the evening. By 11:30 p.m., the snow was falling heavily, the streets nearly deserted. Most of Brooklyn was home, hunkered down against the cold. Menachem left his office and walked toward his car, parked on the street. He never made it. Security camera footage from a nearby business captured what happened next, and the images are the stuff of nightmares. The video is grainy, black and white, obscured by the falling snow, but it's clear enough to see the horror unfolding. Menachem is walking toward his vehicle when a dark minivan pulls up beside him. The side door slides open. Two figures emerge, large, moving quickly despite the snow. They grab Menachem. He fights. You can see the struggle even through the grainy footage, his body twisting, his arms flailing, trying to break free, trying to get away from the men who have seized him. The snow is falling so heavily that the scene looks almost dreamlike, surreal. Silent white flakes cascading down while violence unfolds in slow motion. Menachem is forced into the minivan. The door slides shut. The vehicle drives away, disappearing into the blizzard. The entire abduction takes less than a minute. When Menachem didn't come home that night, his family was concerned but not immediately panicked. The roads were dangerous. Maybe he'd decided to stay at the office rather than risk driving in the storm. Maybe his phone had died and he couldn't call. But by morning, when he still hadn't made contact, they knew something was wrong. They went to his office. His car was still there, parked on the street, covered in snow. Inside the office, everything looked normal. No signs of a struggle. His coat and belongings were still there. The family contacted the NYPD, and when detectives reviewed the security footage, they realized immediately that this was an abduction. A kidnapping captured on video. The investigation moved quickly. Kidnappings are federal crimes, and the FBI joined the effort within hours. The video was analyzed frame by frame, trying to identify any details about the minivan or the attackers. The license plate wasn't visible. Either it had been removed or obscured. But the bigger question was, why? Menachem Stark was wealthy by most standards, but not billionaire-level rich. He owned rental properties in Brooklyn, but his business also carried significant debt. He wasn't the kind of target that professional kidnappers would typically choose if ransom was the motive. Detectives began investigating his business dealings, and what they found was complicated. Menachem had multiple tenants, some of whom had serious grievances. There were lawsuits pending, tenants claiming poor building maintenance, disputes over rent, allegations of harassment. Some of the disputes had become bitter, personal, the kind of conflicts that generate real hatred. There were also business partners and contractors who had financial disputes with Menachem. Money owed, deals gone sour. The messy reality of real estate development where not everyone ends up satisfied. And there were rumors, never confirmed, heavily disputed by his family, that Menachem had been involved in business practices that some considered questionable. The New York Post would later run a headline so insensitive it sparked outrage. Who didn't want him dead? The implication was that Menachem had enough enemies that his murder was almost expected. His family vehemently rejected this characterization. They insisted Menachem was a good man, a devoted father and husband, a pillar of the Hasidic community who was being smeared by sensationalist media coverage. But the investigation couldn't ignore the business disputes. Detectives compiled a list of people who had motive: tenants, contractors, business associates with grudges or financial motivations. And on January 3rd, less than 24 hours after the abduction, the case took a grim turn. A passerby discovered a body in a dumpster behind a gas station in Great Neck, Long Island, about 15 miles from Williamsburg. It was Menachem Stark. He had been burned, doused in gasoline, and set on fire in what appeared to be an attempt to destroy evidence or make identification difficult. But the fire hadn't consumed the body completely. Enough remained for a positive identification through dental records. The autopsy revealed that Menachem had died from asphyxiation. He had been suffocated or smothered before being burned. The exact sequence of events, whether he was killed in the van, killed at another location and then transported, or killed at the dumpster site, wasn't immediately clear. What was clear was that this wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. This was murder, carried out quickly after the abduction, with the body disposed of in a way designed to delay identification and destroy evidence. Then NYPD and FBI intensified their investigation, focusing on individuals with the strongest motives. They interviewed dozens of people: tenants, contractors, business associates. They analyzed phone records and financial transactions. They looked for anyone who might have had the motive and means to orchestrate Menachem's murder. The break came relatively quickly. Detectives identified a group of men who had worked for Menachem as contractors on various properties. There had been a financial dispute, money that Menachem allegedly owed them for work they'd completed. The dispute had escalated, becoming increasingly hostile. One of these men owned a dark minivan matching the description of the vehicle seen in the security footage. Within weeks, the NYPD arrested 4 men: Kendall Felix, Irvine Henry, Erskine Felix, and Kendall Felix, Kendall's cousin. They were charged with kidnapping and murder. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of evidence: cell phone records placing the suspects in the vicinity of Williamsburg on the night of the abduction, financial records documenting the dispute with Menachem, witness testimony, and forensic evidence linking them to the crime. The theory was straightforward. The men had abducted Menachem to force him to pay the money they believed he owed them. But something went wrong. Perhaps Menachem fought too hard. Perhaps they panicked. Perhaps the plan had always been murder, and the kidnapping was just the means. Whatever the reason, they killed him, burned his body to destroy evidence, and dumped him in Great Neck. The trial stretched over several years. Legal maneuvering, appeals, conflicting testimony. But ultimately, convictions were secured. Kendall Felix and Irvine Henry were found guilty of kidnapping and murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Erskine Felix pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony against the others. He received a reduced sentence. Kendall Felix was acquitted, the jury determining that the prosecution hadn't proven his involvement beyond a reasonable doubt. The convictions brought some closure to Menachem's family, though closure in these circumstances is always partial, always incomplete. Knowing who killed someone doesn't undo the trauma of losing them. It doesn't fill the void they leave behind. Menachem's wife was left to raise their 7 children alone. His community mourned the loss of someone they considered a good man, while simultaneously grappling with the media portrayal that had painted him as someone whose death was somehow understandable because of his business practices. The case highlighted the vulnerability that comes with certain kinds of work. Real estate development, particularly in high-pressure markets like New York, creates conflicts, money disputes, tenant grievances, the kind of anger that, in rare cases, can metastasize into violence. And it highlighted the role that weather played in enabling the crime. The blizzard that night wasn't just backdrop. It was accomplice. The heavy snow reduced visibility to almost nothing. It kept people indoors, off the streets, eliminating potential witnesses. It muffled sound, Menachem's struggle, any sounds from the van, anything that might have drawn attention on a normal night. The snow-covered tracks, both literal and metaphorical. Footprints disappeared within minutes under fresh snowfall. Tire tracks were obscured. The physical evidence that might have been left at the scene was buried or washed away. And the cold, brutal cold kept people from being outside unless absolutely necessary. On a normal January night, even late, there would have been some foot traffic in Williamsburg. People walking home, taking out trash, stepping outside for a cigarette. But the polar vortex had emptied the streets. Menachem Stark was abducted in plain sight, on a public street, captured on security cameras. And the blizzard made it possible. The white silence that makes winter in New York feel magical and clean. It hid violence. It concealed murder. It gave the killers cover to act and escape. When you watch that security footage, knowing what happened afterward, the snow takes on a different quality. It's not beautiful anymore. It's sinister. Each flake falling between the camera and the struggling figure becomes part of the mechanism that allowed this to happen. The snowstorm didn't cause Menachem's death. Human cruelty did that. Human decisions, to abduct, to kill, to burn, to discard. But winter was there. Silent and white and all-concealing, just like it always is. 7 stories. 7 people who walked into winter and never came back, or came back only as remains that the season itself had kept hidden until it decided to reveal them. Dorothy Arnold, vanishing from 5th Avenue in 1910 with chocolates and a book, stepping into a void that swallowed her so completely that a century later we still don't know what happened. Agnes Tufferson, murdered by the man she married, her body sealed in a steamer trunk and thrown into the Atlantic, gone forever into the cold depths. Barbara Newell Follett, the literary prodigy who wrote about a girl escaping civilization, and then walked out into December darkness to write her own ending. Ian Burnett, the engineering student who left his phone and wallet behind and vanished into Harlem, leaving nothing but questions that still echo through his family's lives. Rajwinder Kaur, the social worker whose body lay hidden in summer brush until winter stripped the leaves away and finally revealed where she'd been all along. The Gilgo Four, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, whose bones lay wrapped in burlap along Ocean Parkway for years until a December search finally brought them home. And Menachem Stark, abducted in a blizzard that muffled his struggle and covered his killer's tracks. These cases span a century of New York history. They involve different neighborhoods, different circumstances, different kinds of disappearances. But they share common threads that run through all of them like ice water through winter streams. They show us that the city's constant motion, its crowds and noise and endless surveillance, can't protect us. That people can vanish even in the most watched, most populated places on Earth. They show us that winter, beautiful, magical winter, is also an accomplice. That snow muffles screams, that cold preserves bodies, that seasonal changes reveal what summer concealed. And they show us that families endure, that love persists even when hope dies, that every December, while the rest of us are celebrating holidays and making resolutions, there are people who are marking anniversaries of loss, who are wondering what happened to someone they loved, who are living with questions that will never be answered. The case of Ian Burnett remains particularly haunting because it is still so recent, still so open. He disappeared in the age of cell phones, GPS, and omnipresent security cameras. And yet, he is as gone as Dorothy Arnold, as thoroughly vanished as if he had stepped through a door into another dimension. If you have any information about what happened to Ian Burnett on December 30th, 2011, the NYPD is still seeking answers. His family is still waiting. This has been Plain Sight Docs. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe forgotten cases deserve to stay visible, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so these stories continue to reach those who might hold the missing piece. Remember that beneath the holiday lights and the picture-perfect snow, the city holds secrets. And sometimes, it takes winter itself to reveal them. Stay safe out there.